Welcome, everybody. All right, we're talking about complex PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder. And really, what this is a disruptive set of symptoms that emerge after you basically experience inescapable traumatic events, especially those of a horrific or a threatening nature. And that occurs sometimes accumulating over a period of time. And those events are typically interpersonal. They often involve abusive relationships with parents or caregivers or other responsible people at a young age when you are vulnerable to them. It's also sparked by torture, the experience of being a refugee or an asylum seeker, being held in a concentration camp or a slave, or living through a genocidal campaign or organized campaigns of violence. And that can happen within a safe country. That can happen within the context and the privacy of a family. And someone that experiences complex PTSD struggles to control their anger. They are self destructive. They have low self esteem. They find it difficult to trust people. They find intimacy a very difficult thing. And they generally feel a lot of guilt, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of worthlessness, a lot of despair, and a lack of attachment. And any or all of these symptoms can hamper their everyday functioning. Many of these people go towards what's called apathy, which is the opposite of love, that they can actually cut people off in their life very quickly because they've determined that this person's going to hurt me, and so they just shut them out and they box them out. Post-traumatic stress disorder can emerge after surviving a very disturbing experience of any kind, like a physical attack, a sexual assault, a car accident, witnessing a death, or surviving a natural disaster. But complex PTSD is more like a slippery slope. It's not a traumatic event directly, always, but yes, there can be traumatic events that continue to happen, but it's more like abuse, being in an abusive relationship, and it just continues day after day after day after day to the point that you make it home, where you're so used to it that you end up marrying someone that is just like the crappy parents you grew up with. That's because you've made it home. You're used to it. It's something that you feel is normal. And so you end up marrying some turd that's just as awful, if not twice as bad, as your parent who abused you or your parents who abused you. But complex PTSD is a lot of hurtful incidents, last months, even years, especially during childhood. And what happens in that experience, it also forms a sense of seeing yourself as a victim. And that means there's always victim themes. Oh, you're here to hurt me. Oh, you're always doing this to me. Oh, you're me. You've hurt me. You've done this to me. And these people don't even realize they're doing it. And they turn into absolute awful people to be in relationships with because they become narcissistic because they've been abused and neglected for so long that they feel like they're the only person on this world that feels sorry for themselves, and they recognize how pitiful their life has been, and they victimize themselves over and over and over and over again, and they make themselves the most important person that takes all the air within a family. Neglect begets narcissism. We have to understand that. Neglect begets a borderline personality, psychotic people who blow up relationships constantly. Neglect and abuse, complex PTSD, basically creates a person who is highly self centered, highly self preserving, and a very difficult person to want to be in a relationship, and someone that has very little capacity to understand what love and empathy and concern and caring can really buy a human being. It desensitizes the person to cope with life rather than live their life. Now, the complex PTSD is very different from PTSD itself. People living with complex PTSD tend to experience greater interpersonal strife. They have more negative perception of themselves. They feel shame. They have a sense that they are different from everyone else. They also experience more volatile, chaotic personal relationships and greater emotional dysfunction. For example, they can be more prone to rage, and they're more likely than those with PTSD to engage in impulsive, risky, and self destructive behavior. So, once again, if you think about PTSD, if I have, let's say, a cop that's in a shooting, that shooting is a traumatic event. It's called acute anxiety for the first 30 days. If I treat that anxiety with something like EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, that acute anxiety is likely not to become PTSD later on in their life. If they go on untreated, now their brain has a thing called the limbic system that is holding that traumatic event above the brainstem, and every time anything brushes up against the the traumatic event or anything that correlates to the traumatic event, like somebody moving very quickly towards you, or somebody getting in conflict with you, or somebody you're in a crowd where you don't feel safe, all of a sudden those things are going to collect themselves into the limbic system so that you always have fight or flight when anything correlates to that specific event. Now, with complex PTSD, there are heavy amounts of roots of PTSD. So, if you're going to be in an abusive relationship with your parents and your needs are not met, those parents are likely inducing in your brain that every time somebody raises their voice, you become defensive or you go quiet or run away or become passive aggressive. And all of a sudden, that automatic response is the way that you deal with conflict in your marriage. So, this is kind of how complex PTSD works. It takes on signals of when things are going to blow up in your home when you're growing up and your parents are turning into the monsters that they are, and you're stuck in that trap of living with these horrible human beings, and then you're all of a sudden out in the free world, and anybody that has behavior related to what your parents demonstrated when you grew up, now those people contribute to the PTSD, because the PTSD just keeps growing and growing and growing based on events that rub against the trauma that you had when you were growing up, or the trauma that you had with PTSD with particular traumatic events that had never been treated. See, once again, the limbic system collects events, and that collection of events are when I felt my life was unsafe, when I went into a panic attack. What was going on? What was the smell? What was the visual? What was the audio? What was all the sensory perceptions? Our brain collects all those from traumatic events and puts them above our brainstem so that we never have to think. We go to fight or flight automatically. So people with complex PTSD tend to experience greater interpersonal strife. They have a more negative experience, in interacting with people, but they also have a more negative perception of themselves because they feel powerless. They feel shame. They have a sense that they're different from everybody else. And what's strange about people that see themselves as outsiders, the only reason they are an outsider is because they see themselves as an outsider and they behave as one. It's not like people have assigned them as an outsider. If you act like an insider, you will be an insider. They also experience more volatile, chaotic personal relationships and greater emotional dysfunction. For example, they can be more prone to rage. They're more likely than those with PTSD to engage in this impulsive, risky, self-destructive types of behavior, which I've said before. But the bottom line is they tend to push people away. They have a problem with attachment. They become anxiously attached or avoidingly attached. They do not like to identify with other people's suffering because they identify with their own suffering more than anybody else. They figure, I've had enough suffering in this life. I don't need to be around other people who are suffering. I don't want to care about anybody else's suffering because I just suffer in this life and I am the only one that ever cared about my own suffering. And they convince themselves that they are their own best friend, that I must self-soothe myself. Complex PTSD is not in the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the DSM-5, and it's not there because it hasn't been recognized as a disorder. And there's a real good chance that the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health is not going to be revised because nobody can agree on gender identity problems. The truth is that transvestites have a gender identity disorder, but they don't want to be called that. They don't want to be recognized to have mental illness. People that have gender identity problems, that they don't know if they're a man or a woman, the people that are attracted, to the opposite sex, or it's a mental disorder currently in the DSM-5. Are they ever going to have a DSM-6? No, because all the transvestites are on the board that create the DSM-6, and therefore, and all these crazy ass mental health people that are now on the boards of the DSM-6, they're going to likely invent something that's going to lean towards gender identity not being a problem, that these are just perfectly wonderful people. They should be running your lives. They should be making all of your government decisions, and they should decide what the world should look like, even though they are 2% of our population. However, well, not the gender identities. Gender identities are all over the place, but the transies are about 1 to 2%, but they would love to run the world. So, re-experiencing the event through vivid, intrusive memories, flashbacks, repeated dreams, nightmares, conflicts in your marriage, conflicts with your children, conflicts in relationships, all of this builds and builds and builds complex PTSD. What is very, very important is if you're going to treat complex PTSD, you have to identify what the triggers are that create the complex PTSD. And once you deal with the triggers, you have to go to the events and start working through the events that created the triggers. That is how you treat PTSD in general, but that's how you have to treat complex PTSD, because now you have to start cutting out the roots that are attached to the disorder. You can't just treat it once. You've got to treat all of the roots to be able to get rid of the Olympic system fight or flight responses to these events and anything that rubs up against these events. A heightened perception of threat leading to hypervigilance or making someone easily startled is a very high indicator of PTSD complex. People that are hypervigilant, obsessed, or they're easily startled, these are people that have complex PTSD. The core symptoms of PTSD, someone with complex PTSD may be very reactive to minor stressors. So what differentiates an adult from a child is one major ingredient. You're moving from being a very reactive person to a very responsive person. What that means is you take the time to think your reaction through, that you look at the consequences before you start speaking and doing and saying and responding. People with complex PTSD and PTSD often have a very difficult time not being reactive. They get reactive. Oh my God, I'm on a plane. I'm going to freak out. Oh my God. Oh, I'm in Walmart and that reminds me of the battlefield, so I'm going to freak out. Oh, I'm about to unlock my car and that's when somebody attacked me and did that. Oh my gosh, I'm in the railway station and suddenly I'm worried about somebody shooting me because I saw it on television. People that have all this stuff, they become very, very reactive, which is childish. And you don't want to live like that because you'll never survive being reactive. You will die if you lived in the jungle if you're a reactive person. You have to be responsive. You have to be able to have the kind of brain that is calm enough in the storm to figure out what is the best choices to make, or to be understand what the quickest and most efficient choices are to make. That is very, very important. The other problem with complex PTSD is these people overthink everything because they don't know why they're having fight or flight reactions to half of the things they have, and they feel like their life is out of control. So they end up having panic attacks over and over and over again. That's another ingredient that, hey, you probably have complex PTSD. All right, we're going to take a break and we're going to come right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about complex PTSD. You know, will everyone who experiences childhood trauma develop complex PTSD? The answer is really no. Not every person who endures experiences that lead to complex PTSD develop symptoms themselves. Most people will experience acute stress after trauma, but for many of the symptoms may pass to a period of weeks, typically within 3 months. And the presence of another mental health disorder, the lack of social or emotional support, intergenerational trauma, chronic physical ailments could increase your risk of complex PTSD. If you're going to be raised by parents who have been traumatized themselves and love to project their wonderful trauma on their children and each other without ever healing it, and just walk around like a bomb ready to be stepped on where nobody knows where it is, and you want children that are growing up walking on eggshells because of your psychotic behavior, you're probably going to once again intergenerationally pass on your trauma to your children because you never ever dealt with your own crap. And there are so many horrendously breeding stock parents out there that do this. It's sickening. But they do because they don't believe in mental health. I can't go to a counselor. I'm not crazy. Yes, you are crazy, and yes, you are stupid because you've never ever tried to treat trauma and you've passed it on to your children like a lunatic. People are so self-consumed and so stupid and egotistical that they will allow themselves to give trauma that they have experienced in their childhood to their children. Unfortunately, people are so stupid and self-consuming that they will do that. And they do it over and over and over and over again. And they torture their children all the way through their childhood with their own trauma, just like a self centered person that they were, and the person that raised them being self centered. It's foolish and it's awful. It's awful. But they do it. And then they take them to Disneyland so the kids will all feel better and they feel important. These are people that obsess on creating positive experiences for their kids because they feel guilt and shame for all the crap they put them through when they're home. Women have higher rates of complex PTSD than men. Research suggests in a woman the condition tends to be accompanied by a wider range of severe symptoms. Why? Because by nature, women are weaker, especially as children. And so, what do they often experience? They experience people taking advantage of them because they have a physical package that men and even some now these lesbian crazy women uh, want to have because nobody wants to have sex with their own with the opposite sex because they can't stand each other anymore. They're not even breeding. We're not even having children anymore because everybody wants to stick it in each other's butt or play with each other's vagina. But complex PTSD emerges at any age. It can present at different ages. So if you married somebody who has complex PTSD, and yes, you go through the honeymoon phase and you breed with them, and you think that they walk on water, and then all of a sudden they drop their crap on you after you get married because you're stuck with them, then what happens is that complex PTSD introduces itself to you, and you get to have PTSD also, just like they do. Most people, and the problem is it can be treated, but are people humble enough to do that? Probably not. Are they too lazy to do that? Probably. Would they rather torture the world with their own crap and be the victim of life? Yeah, they generally enjoy that more often. Complex PTSD is more likely to involve cognitive challenge like difficulty with attention or organization, emotional regression, recklessness, aggressive behavior, including substance abuse, unsafe sex, unsafe driving, self harm. These are high indicators that this person has PTSD that has never been treated. And nobody's ever going to treat it unless they want it treated, unless they recognize they have it and they really want to fix it. And the problem is, there's not a lot of people out there in this world that are qualified to treat it because there's so much of it. It's difficult to diagnose complex PTSD, especially if a clinician does not know that the individual has experienced specific trauma like child abuse, or someone may resist discussion of it. In children, symptoms of complex PTSD may overlap with common symptoms of depression, eating disorders, sleep disorders, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, separation anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, even bipolar behaviors can develop. It's called cyclothymic depression, can develop from complex PTSD. So it overlaps. And what the problem is that complex PTSD is a grieving process, and it's a long one because you keep getting traumatized over and over and over again because you put yourself in environments that keep traumatizing you. The conditions also have similar symptoms. They lead to difficulty with emotional regulation, impulsivity, chaotic in personal relationships, and both may be experiences of trauma. And according to some research, borderline personality disorder could actually be considered one of the set of conditions influenced by trauma, especially childhood abuse. What are borderline personalities? They're batshit crazy. Borderline personality people create conflict everywhere they go, and they are never responsible, and they are always smarter than everybody else, including their doctor, their lawyer, and every other person on the planet, their parents, their spouse, their children. They think they walk on water, but they know they're a freaking bomb everywhere they go, but they don't understand it, and they blame it on everybody else. There are differences between complex PTSD and borderline that should enable someone to distinguish between the two. Borderline personality is characterized by a strong fear of abandonment. I hate you, don't leave me. People living with borderline personality are also more likely to engage in self harm, to experience threats of killing themselves to get attention most of the time than those who experience complex PTSD. Although it's not uncommon for complex PTSD, borderlines tend to have 1 in 4 people with PTSD also meet the criteria of borderline personality disorder. Why? Because they were neglected in childhood, they were abused in childhood, they were treated differently in childhood, and so they walk into their adult life without the ability to have individuated. So they start to individuate through everybody else. They'll attach to their spouse, they'll attach to their children, and they form these weird bonds of love and hate with these people. I love you one day and I hate you the next day. I love you, and oh, now you have to earn my love. Oh, well, if you don't do this, then I can't love you. They're just jerks, and they don't even realize they're doing it. They don't even want to get treated for it. They think this is who they are, and they just operate this way. But it all comes from trauma. And when you're with somebody and you're married to one of these people, you wait till you divorce them, because I'll tell you what, you never know who you marry till you divorce them. And when you divorce them, oh boy, these borderlines will eat you alive. Complex PTSD people will eat you alive, because now they have a theater full of people watching all of the victim themes that you ever wanted to celebrate about yourself. Now I have a place to stage my performance of how much of a victim I am of the human being that I married. And then the other place where you really find these people But where they really show up and really blow everything up is the reading of the will. And when they determine that they're entitled to something that everybody else is not, or when they've determined that they're being cheated, these turkeys blow the world up when a will is read, like they are entitled to everything that their parents have worked for in their lives. They're not entitled. They think the world should wipe their ass. These people are crazy, crazy, crazy people who probably should be in prison, but probably have walked the line and been smart enough not to go. Cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, is most often the first choice, helping people deal with complex PTSD. Therapist basically helps the individual identify thought patterns that help them be unstuck in their traumatic experiences, begin to replace them with more positive, more productive experiences, because they're helping them recognize how the trauma is affecting their life, and now they're starting to get some objectivity to what is going on. There's no medications that can really help with complex PTSD, but oftentimes antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids often are used, but they are a band-aid to complex PTSD. Taking PTSD seriously is facing complex PTSD treatment. Now, EMDR can be a very effective treatment for somebody with complex PTSD, but once again, you have to go experiences after experiences, route after route, identifying most of the areas where blunt trauma has taken place, and then where other trauma has taken place correlated to the blunt trauma. Anybody that's seeking treatment, people living with complex PTSD, they have to be active. They need to be people who are proactive in their life and who are facing it and saying, yeah, this is a problem that I've got to fix. They want to have good exercise. They want to have good sleep habits. They want to have social engagement. They want to have accountability in their life. One of the things that's always missing from narcissistic and borderline personality people, and even people with complex PTSD, the one thing that often correlates is they gaslight everybody else to be responsible for the crap that they have created. They cannot understand why they've done the things they've done, but they want to make damn sure that everybody else, including their 2-year-old child, is to blame for all of their problems. These people are perpetual victims. They go through life like this and they will make you think you are absolutely crazy. People who don't get their trauma treated make sure that everybody in their life is accountable for their trauma except for themselves. Complex PTSD is worsened by triggers that resemble original trauma, such as, certain sights, certain sounds, certain smells, which can cause a fight or flight response. It leads to emotional distress, flashbacks, nightmares, anything in your environment that has something correlated back to the trauma. So, what do those things look like? Reminders of trauma, like any sense of input or sensory input, like a sight, a sound, a smell, a situation that reminds a person of the traumatic event, triggers the symptoms. Stressful or intense situations, fast-paced or overwhelming environments are difficult for them to manage. Lack of sleep. Sleep disturbances like nightmares, insomnia are common and can exacerbate symptoms. Surprise and invasion of personal space. Unexpected loud noises, sudden movements, touching without permission can activate fear and a feeling of being threatened. Negative social interactions, feelings of rejection or abandonment can be particularly painful, especially if it's a high conflict marriage. Internal emotional stressors, avoiding people, places, situations associated with trauma prevents the person from learning that they can manage their fear and anxiety. Difficulties trusting in relationships, deep-seated difficulty in trusting another person. How can you ever grow love if you don't know how to trust? People who cannot trust do not know how to love. You cannot grow love without trust. Trust comes from an emotional trust, which means I understand you emotionally, financial trust, and physical trust. And if you don't have those three components in a relationship, the love will not grow. You can love someone and not trust them, but you'll never grow the love until you do trust. So the binder of all relationships is trust. That is what makes love grow. If you don't value trust, or if you don't understand how to trust, you're not a person that's going to grow your life. You're just walking through this life until you die. You know, there are countless billions of people on this planet who live a suicidal life. They're taking drugs, they're drinking alcohol, they're not taking care of their body, they're fat as a pig. You know, they can't walk, they can't exercise, they can't even go to their freaking mailbox. And the reason is because they want to die. They just don't have the guts to kill themselves. So what they do is they live on a slippery slope waiting to die by treating themselves horribly until they eventually croak off. Everybody watches it. Everybody knows they're going to die. They don't know when they're going to die. I have no sympathy for people who live a suicidal life. I have empathy for them, but I have no sympathy for someone who wants to die and who wants their children and everybody who loves them watch them die because they're a fat pig who won't take care of themselves, or they drink themselves to death, or they can't control their little drug habit or whatever. If you're going to live that way, everybody's watching you kill yourself. You got to realize that. That's called a suicidal life. Difficulties with emotional flashbacks is another complex PTSD problem. Feelings of hopelessness. They live in perpetual depression because they expect themselves to be healthy even though they're not, instead of understanding that they have to move their expectations to preferences. You know, I prefer that I wasn't a traumatized person, but I am. I would prefer that I got better treatment for my complex trauma so I didn't induce it on you and make you a victim of me. I wish and hope and prefer that I would not say these things, but I have said them. So that is the beginning of acceptance. Acceptance is peace. Acceptance is the beginning of accountability and the way that you will lead yourself into treating complex trauma. Hypervigilance and paranoia. That's another sign. Oh, they're probably going to say this about me, or they've said that about me, or they're going to do this, or they're going to do that, or oh, they always say this. I can't be around those people. Blah, 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 blah. You know, people that are like that, crazy, horrible people to have to be around, that have to set the conditions for where they can and cannot go, or can and cannot be accepted. Human behavior, regular human behavior, the one that can survive in the middle of the jungle, are people that are resilient and understand that I will deal and adapt to whatever environment I am in. I am not going to diminish my life based on my fear. I'm going to live in faith that I have the strength, I have the wherewithal to survive and to adapt. And if you begin to live that way, you will move yourself out of complex trauma. Complex PTSD develops as a result of sustained, repeated, multiple forms of traumatic events, like victims of bullying, marrying a bully, emergency service workers, like chronic sexual, psychological, physical abuse, neglect, chronic intimate partner violence, victims of kidnapping, hostage situations, victims of slavery, marrying somebody from a culture that doesn't match up with your own culture. All of these things can happen, and it can be a really nasty thing. People will breed with each other and they think while they're in the honeymoon phase that that's going to make a great relationship. Well, the honeymoon phase is meant for procreation of the human species. It's not meant to set the groundwork for what your relationship with that person is going to look like. It is about screw until you have children, because we have to create more kids as human beings. That's what the honeymoon phase is about. Once you've moved out of it, it's back into how do we adapt to the human being that we're with now that we bred with them. In childhood, where there's abuse and neglect, the kid will gravitate towards a specific 4F type to survive, which becomes our trauma in childhood. When we're triggered by adults, we lean into whatever type of trauma we've had in childhood as home, and then we'll go marry it. We'll go make best friends who do the same thing to us that our parents did. Codependent people, when you're a child and you're with narcissistic parents who don't care about you and you have to bend all of yourself to cater to them, that codependency means you're being taught to marry a narcissist because narcissists will only be with a codependent person. That's all they can tolerate. They have to have somebody that is going to be accountable for all of their stupidity. My stupidity is all you. You are to blame for everything. That's what they have to marry. That's what they groom. And that's what they cultivate for their whole lives. A codependent partner is the only thing that a narcissist can marry. Somebody who will cater to all of their stupidity and spend the rest of their life locked in the prison of the narcissist who was locked in a prison by their narcissistic parents. All right, we're going to take another break. We're going to come right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about complex PTSD. Now, there are four F's to PTSD. The first one is these are the symptoms, how the results of trauma. First is flight. People that are flight oriented unconsciously believe that control and power can create safety, secure love, satisfy abandonment. They learn to respond to feelings of abandonment with anger. Many use contempt as a brand of narcissistic rage and disgust, and as a way to shame and intimidate other people. They treat others as if they're extensions of themselves. People who are narcissists are fight types, but not all fight types are narcissists. Those who aren't true narcissists have the ability to come to understanding that their intimidation, criticism, sarcasm, and aggressive behavior is ruining their relationships. These are people that are called covert narcissists. And sometimes these people don't realize what they're doing to other people. The fight types can become sociopathic. They're like a charming bully. They're able to be friendly to some at some of the time, and they have the possibility to listen and be helpful occasionally, but they still use contempt to control and overpower other people. They're highly judgmental. They're people that are two-faced. They say one thing to you in person, and they say another thing to the person at home that they find comfort in. So they basically have two views of every human being. And at any given moment, anybody will become their enemy, even their best friend, even their mother, even their sibling, and they will draw a wall down and punish that person because they don't like what they did to them, or they don't like the fact that they did not take accountability for how they hurt the narcissist, the complex PTSD person. And so they use fight, and they use it as a very controlling, they're charming at times, and they're bullies at other times. These are dirtbags. They're hard to work with, they're hard to deal with, and they're sure as hell hard to be married with because other people see them as charming. And then oftentimes when you're married to them or being raised by them, they're total bullies. They're total jerks when it comes to disciplining their kids. That's why complex PTSD needs to be treated and identified. It's very important. Not for you, for everybody else that has to deal with your ugly ass and all the people you hurt because of your complex PTSD. If you're ever going to do anything Christ like in your life, treat your freaking PTSD so not everybody else in the world has to be a victim of it. And then they have to be blamed because you can't take accountability for anything you do. Then there's a flight oriented. They're unconsciously and obsessively driven by the belief that perfection will make them lovable and safe. Well, we're not perfect. We're human. You're not going to be perfect. If you want to be psychotic, try to be perfect. Achievement is always on their mind. As children, they respond to family trauma on a hyperactive continuum, moving between extremes of being a star student and an ADHD dropout. They attempt to flee their internal pain by remaining busy with something like sports or their good grades being the if you're going to see somebody who's the summa cum laude of their class, that's probably a traumatized person at home that had to deal with these ugly ass parents that they were raised by because the only way that they were measured on their human spirit and their human experiences is if they got straight A's. That's how dumb people are when they raise their kids. It's common for flight types to have left brain disassociation, which means they're constantly thinking of how to distract themselves from underlying abandonment. So they're always locking themselves in their room or getting caught up in activities. They're doing anything to distract themselves from these psychotic parents that they have. And it's pretty easy for flight types to become addicted to their own adrenaline. So when they get married, you never see them. You don't know why they're playing golf every day. You don't know why they're doing, other activities. You don't know why they're spending time with people that they have a fun time with that are very surfacey. That's because they have to avoid their pain. They're coping with life. Pursuing risky and dangerous activities gives them an adrenaline high, which also means the addiction in general is something they're in danger in, and including work, keeping busy, stimulating substances. The flight types are severely traumatized and develop obsessive compulsive disorder around the things that they enjoy, that they use as their coping skills. So they have these routines that they develop in their day and they obsess on those routines. They can't be who they are without these routines because they have learned to avoid their pain in that way. They cannot face their life. And do they breed? Yes. Do they become parents? Yes. Do they become employees? Yes. Do they own businesses? Yes. And then they drop their psychotic symptoms on everybody else in the world and traumatize them. They got to create more of what they are. Then you have the freeze types. They have the deepest unconscious belief that people equal danger. Social anxiety is common, but freeze types stop attempting to relate to others and become very isolated. They may also sacrifice the possibility of love. So the scapegoat child is usually the one that's forced to lean towards the freeze response. The freeze response requires the right brain to go offline, causing them to disconnect from experiencing any abandonment pain, protecting them from social interactions that might risk triggering feelings of being traumatized. They are avoiding trauma at all costs. These people freeze because they're able to change their internal channel, whether they're having an inner experience that makes them uncomfortable. So the freeze type requires a therapeutic relationship more than any other because their isolation prevents them from being in a healing relationship through a friendship. These people are agoraphobic. They will hide in their little hovel and live in their own little world and make it so that they cannot interact with many people that they don't feel safe with. These people feel safest with their most predictable people in their life, even if they're unhealthy. These people will ground themselves in the accountability to have to work in a work environment and adapt to whatever creature their employer has hired. Then there's the fawn types. These are codependent. And these are groomed. They have the unconscious belief that the admission to any relationship is to merge with the wishes, the demands, the needs of others while forfeiting their boundaries, their rights, their needs, their preferences. And so they're like what you hear these turkeys say is, "Oh, I'm a giver. I always give." Well, what is your value if you're a giver? Really? How's anybody ever going to respect you if you can't make a freaking decision for yourself? If you can't decide for yourself alone in this world what you like and don't like, how is anybody ever going to love you? If you're one of these people that have to integrate everybody else's needs before your own, how's anybody ever going to respect you? If you want to become adult, if you want to become a human being, you have to make choices and stand behind them, and they can be different than other people. And you have to be able to say, hey, this is what I prefer. Okay, you like that? All right, let's compromise. But if you're a person that does what everybody else wants you to do, first of all, you've been groomed by a narcissist. Second of all, you don't like conflict and you have not graduated into your adult life. You're still a child in an adult body, breeding, doing all the stupid things, being an employee, torturing your staff with your lack of boundaries, and torturing the world with your lack of boundaries because you invite narcissists left and right into your life and you attract them in every way, shape, form, and fashion. And you're probably married to them and you're probably creating them because you have to spend all your energy on your stupid marital partner instead of the children that you bred and created on your own. Instead of that, you have a protective relationship with your kids where you take all the hits from your narcissistic partner. Boy, that's fun. But complex PTSD does that. And being married to someone with complex PTSD does that. And if it's never treated and you married a turd that will never get it treated, you're probably better off making different choices and getting your kids away from the jerk. Fawn types are most developmentally arrested because they've been ashamed and scared out of developing a healthy sense of self. Well, what is a healthy sense of self? It's being able to decide what you like and what you don't like and standing up for it. And guess what? You can change your mind anytime you want. The main difference between the disorders of trauma, PTSD, and complex PTSD is singular events, complex trauma is multiple events. It's long lasting, it's repeated, it's continuous. The type of repeated exposure of PTSD is referred to in many ways, but complex PTSD is the newest, most comprehensive term. It's repeated exposure to disaster, accidents, deaths, and violent acts, child abuse, neglect, frequent need to deliver traumatic news to other people, like being a doctor, living under severe threat of extended period of time, being forced to be a sex worker, domestic abuse, cult membership, having to witness ongoing abuse and violence of another person, regular and repeated exposure to verbal abuse, emotional abuse, threats, long term exposure to bullying, kidnappings, hostage taking, prisoner of war, frequent sexual victimization, regular long term feelings of captivation or powerlessness. That creates complex PTSD. To treat it, the most effective treatment, there are two, I believe, most effective treatments. One is EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. What that means is they borrowed the REM stage of sleep by creating eye movement. The eye movement stimulates the memory glands in the back of the brain. When the blood flow is going to the back of the brain and you're reprocessing traumatic events, it pulls the memory out of the limbic system that's being accessed. The traumatic events are in the limbic system. It accesses the limbic system and it reprocesses that information into the memory glands, which are being stimulated by eye movement or sound. By doing that, what happens is the brain will move the furniture to the memory gland and drop a window between the event and yourself. So you remember everything that happened in the traumatic event, but you no longer have fight or flight. That's how you move the furniture. That's why EMDR is so effective with trauma. However, you have to treat all of the roots associated to the trauma with complex PTSD. The other treatment that I believe is one of the most effective treatments of complex trauma is equestrian therapy. When you have a young horse that is unbroken and has not formed a human relationship, what happens is if you develop a relationship with a young horse who has never had a human relationship, and what you have to do is you have to calm down all of your nervous system. You have to calm down all of your mental health issues enough to adapt to a relationship with the horse, because the horse will never come to you if you have a high inability to manage your nerves and an inability to manage your psyche. Horses read that in human beings. They will buck them off. They will not form a relationship with a psychotic person. You have to learn to control all of your feelings. You have to learn to control all of your mental disorder to have that relationship with a horse. In doing that, you have learned how to manage your own trauma. And that is one of the most effective, comprehensive treatments of complex PTSD. And if you have that, I would recommend it. It's called equestrian therapy. It is a beautiful, wonderful thing to experience that. Many people who come back from war in the military have done equestrian therapy and found enormously great results coming from that. And I would highly recommend it. But there's other treatment, and that's like cognitive therapy. Cognitive is thought-based therapy, where you take each traumatic event and convert it, and that can be another way to treat it. All right, that's our show. I want to thank everybody for listening. I love hearing from you. You can do that on our webpage, voiceamerica.media.com and libsyn.com, Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. Now remember, some people do not suffer from mental illness. They enjoy it. The mind replays what the heart can't delete. Also, PTSD is created by doing what others fear. Thank you for listening, everybody.